Daly is going to tell us how to solve.
Good morning, Alice, thank you. I don't know if I can solve all of your emergencies, but first, I guess a non-emergency. Bridget has one more scarf, ladies, so if you have not shopped to your heart's content on scarves, we do have the Dumbarton Health scarf with us as well. So see her if you want to bring one home with you. So yes, this morning we're going to talk about emergency planning, and when Alice and Anna first asked me to prepare a presentation on emergencies, I thought at first, well, I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about this because we haven't had really many emergencies at Dumbarton House. And then I thought about it a little bit, and I started to make a list, and I thought, well, actually, in my past 5 years as director, we have had a gas leak, an electrical fire, an air conditioning failure in July twice, a hurricane, multiple hurricanes, lightning strikes, 3 visitors at least who were injured or had a medical emergency on site, unprecedented blizzards in Washington, 3 in 1 year, a death on site, sinkholes, 3 just this past year, flooding, income shortfalls when, of course, the recession hit, mold, multiple mold issues, a fire alarm meltdown, which led to, at one point, the system having to be taken offline and us having to man the site 24/7 and do hourly walkthroughs, and an earthquake. You all may remember the earthquake that we had a couple of years ago. My staff like to joke because I tend to be on Danes trips or vacations when many of these strike. So I was actually in Ocean City on the beach when the earthquake hit. But alas, so when I came to think about it, I realized, well, we really have had a number of emergencies that we have tackled. But what I'm here today to hope to share with you all is that if you can plan for these, if you can think proactively and have procedures in place, then it keeps the emergencies from becoming true crises, and it can help you manage them so that they're really just more of an inconvenience, and you can deal with the unexpected more easily. So that's what I hope that we can do today, is talk a little bit about how to do that. In the end, failing to plan, strategic plan, emergency plan, funding plan, in general, failing to plan is simply planning to fail. So if you don't sit down and put some time into it ahead of time, thinking through how you're going to get to where you want to go and how you're going to prevent emergencies from becoming real crises, you're never going to be able to manage successfully your museum property. What you see on the slide here, I don't know if you can read it, but you've got, clearly a plane not doing so well, and the pilot is saying, my emergency plan will be ready next week. Enjoy the rest of your flight. And so we want to make sure that when we get back to our museum properties, we can have emergency plans in place or get them ready before the situation on the screen. When we talk about emergency planning, ladies, you can see on the slide, sometimes these are called disaster preparedness plans, sometimes they're called emergency response plans. It's all basically the same thing. And we're going to spend the first half of this hour talking about the actual kind of fundamentals of an emergency plan, so who to include and what to include in that template, and then how to train people, what resources are available. And then we're going to spend the second half of our hour talking about financing emergencies, so planning for the financial impact of an emergency and how you prepare for that piece of the puzzle, because that can be just as important. So first, in terms of developing an emergency plan, the who. With emergency planning, the process is actually more important, much more important than the end document itself. So kind of similar to accreditation, that Scott and our group, we talked about that a little bit yesterday, that accreditation has a lot of planning and meetings and process involved in it, and that process is really the meaningful part. The end document that you get is the result, and it's important to have, but the process is really what's most important, because it gets your key players around the table talking about the important issues and laying out the procedures and identifying what they need to know to respond in the case of an emergency. And emergency planning should be a team effort. It cannot just be one person off at a desk drafting an emergency plan and then checking it off a list. If it is that, it will not be effective in an actual emergency. So it has to be a team effort. There must, of course, be a leader. There's got to be somebody who's doing the actual drafting, who's collecting all the information, who's scheduling the meetings, who's getting the people around the table. But then you definitely need representation from your collections department, be it staff or volunteers. You've got to have folks at the table who are familiar with and involved with the facilities management aspect of your museum property, and then with the people aspect, so the folks who are in contact with your visitors or volunteers or human resources and staff. And then you might want to have representatives from the board or various committees, or depending on the size of your staff and your operation, perhaps a PR component, an HR component, a finance component. So those are some others that you could include. But at the very least, you need a leader, you need representation from collections, facilities, and the people part of your operation. Then when you get those folks together, what you're ultimately going to wind up with is an actual, working toward an actual draft plan. And there are lots of templates out there. Generally, they break out into a couple key parts. And so usually an emergency plan will have some kind of an introduction. It'll include how the plan is organized, where it's stored, who updates it, when is it updated, who developed it, why did you develop it, kind of the rationale, where are the copies, the introduction materials. And then you get into the meat. So the second part of your plan is usually going to be your emergency preparedness and prevention. So any good kind of emergency plan starts with thinking about how can you actually prevent an emergency from happening. So this might include information about how do you safeguard your records, how do you prevent damage to your collection. So what do you have in place in terms of pest management so that you can avoid having issues with pests in your collection. What kind of moisture monitoring do you have? If there are areas where you know you have moisture issues or you have active leak situations, what is your process for monitoring that, checking on that, protecting collections or people that are in that vicinity? Where are your emergency supplies located? What's in them? How often are they inventoried? Who replenishes the Band-Aids and the first aid kits? And what are your security measures? So who has access to the site? Who logs out keys? Do you have an alarm system? Who has the codes? How are you monitoring that when you have staff turnover? How do you change codes? The side of it in terms of helping to prevent an emergency from actually happening. And so that would be kind of the second chunk of your plan. The third chunk is the chunk that I think most of us think of first when we think of an emergency plan, and it is absolutely critical. It's then the response procedure part. So if an emergency hits, how do we respond? There are 3 emergency types that we should all prepare for, that any museum property, any historic site should prepare for. And those are medical or injury emergencies, water, because even if you're not in an area that's prone to flooding or hurricanes, you certainly have pipes that bring water into your building. So water is something that we all need to prepare for. And fire. Again, fires can break out for any number of reasons. So we all should absolutely be prepared for medical, water, and fire emergencies. Beyond that, you might have some individualization depending on where you're located in terms of what other sections might be included in your plan. You want to address natural disasters that are relevant for your area. So are you in a hurricane-prone area or an earthquake-prone area? We did not in DC have an earthquake plan. We didn't have a special earthquake coverage in our insurance policy until just recently. And it was because we got hit with that, 5.8 earthquake a couple of years ago, unheard of. But many of you are in earthquake zones, on the West Coast where you would deal with that more regularly. Wind damage. We have absolutely had tree branches and in some cases trees come down. Or snow. Of course, our friends up in New England would have to be prepared for significant snow. Those of us in urban areas, or certainly in the DC area, would want to be prepared for things like terrorism or possible violence. A couple of years ago, of course, the Holocaust Museum had a gunman on site. Immediately, the American Alliance of Museums put out standards and best practice on how to respond to a shooter in your museum, and that's something that we've incorporated into our Dumbarton House thinking about emergencies. And terrorism, not just from the perspective of, if your site is a target, likely Dumbarton House will not be high on a list of terrorist targets, but if there is a terrorist incident in Washington, how do we deal with that at Dumbarton House? How do we evacuate our visitors? How do we evacuate staff? If we have to lock down and are forced to remain in the city, how do we deal with that? If we have to evacuate and get out of the city, what are the routes? So thinking about terrorism might be an issue depending on your location. And what's key in any response procedure, the last point on here, of course, we're all here because we're working on behalf of these incredibly historic properties with invaluable collections. But at the end of the day, your response procedures always start with the people. And that is our first point of training on any response procedure, is that you have to retain your safety or protect your safety first and foremost, and the safety of the people that are around you first. So the humans always get focused on first. How many of you all here have a written emergency plan for your museum property that you know of? Okay, a couple of hands. Maybe more of us have them, or I'm sure. Do your plans, I'm just curious, I'm assuming they all, if you do have one, they have a medical, water, and kind of fire contingent. Do many of you have sections on natural disasters? Are there any that have specific sections on hurricanes or earthquakes or wind or snow? Or am I forgetting any hurricane section for our Georgia folks? Am I forgetting any natural disasters? Tornado, yes, thank you. Of course, that would never occur to me in DC. We rarely have tornadoes, but some of you all would have those in the plains. Good. Do any of your plans include sections on terrorism or violence? Okay. Good. Yeah. And I'd love to collect samples from your sites so that we can provide them to the folks at the workshop today, online and others, and have examples from different types of museums in different areas of the country. So I'll probably be following up with you after our session. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes,
The one I think has been sent and put up on the website.
Yes.
We received a commendation from the AAM when we were going in for our accreditation on the disaster.
Well, so Eva just said that their Virginia plan received a commendation from AAM. Kudos. And we will make sure that the Virginia plan, which includes, of course, Wilton, is posted on the website for you all to be able to see. So again, we often think of the response procedures as an emergency plan, and it is absolutely, this is a critical part of your plan. But I don't want to forget about the prevention piece that came first, and then this next piece, which has to do with then cleanup and salvage. So we think again of the immediate crisis and how do we get people out of the site or save the collection. But there's the secondary or follow-up piece of, okay, once the emergency has happened, then how do you deal with the repercussions of that emergency? So cleanup and salvage is a typical part of an emergency plan for a museum or historic site. It would include information about what to save first. So in the event of emergency, if you do have time to save things beyond just the people, what goes first? And there are different ways that you can deal with this. At Dumbarton House, we have a short kind of top 10 list. It's on bright yellow paper. It's at every staff workstation. So if an emergency hit and we did have time, we've got a crib sheet of the 10 objects we try to get out of the museum first. I've seen other museums where they have in collection storage a little color code system. So some objects are green, others are yellow, and then there's red. And so depending on the color, that indicates which objects come out first or second or third. So again, if you're in a time crunch situation, you can only get out a few things. What do you get out first? It's important to think not just about monetary value, of course, of your collection pieces, but also whether they are unique or unique to your site, how critical they are to your interpretation. So some of our Dumbarton House pieces are certainly some of the most valuable, but the ones on our top 10 list to evacuate, but others are coming out because they're simply indispensable to our house's history or the family that lived in the house. They could not be replaced, as of course many of our objects could not. After you identify kind of what you're saving first, then you have to think through how you deal with it after the emergency. How do you stabilize it if it's an issue of flooding? How do you deal with different collections getting wet? What about smoke damage or actual fire? Who's responsible for what? So what staff members or volunteers do you have that are knowledgeable, that are going to oversee these various sections? We have different staff assigned to the museum collection than we do for our NSCDA historical documents in the archive. So we've got kind of a divide and conquer ability to focus on different aspects of our operation. If you don't have expertise in-house, who are you going to reach out to? Who can you access to help give advice and guide you through the process of dealing with your collections issues after the emergency? And then the kind of business side of things. How do you continue operations if you do have some kind of an emergency? It might be kind of a very short-term issue, like we had the air conditioning go out in July and we had a wedding scheduled that weekend. What do? What's the contingency plan? How do you address that? How do you keep the doors open to visitors? Do you have to keep the doors open to visitors? What if we had a big Dames meeting scheduled that week? And it might be longer term. What if it's an issue where it's not just air conditioning is going to be out for 2 weeks, but it's actually something that has a long-term impact on your site? Do you need off-site storage for your collections? How are you going to relocate staff and volunteers to deal with your society business if you can't get back into your facility for some time? So thinking about kind of what comes after the actual critical moments of the emergency is important to include in that plan. And then the fifth section that typically is in any plan are the actual kind of nuts and bolts that are institutionally specific. There's lots of resources out there we'll talk about in a minute, but you can never just take an emergency plan off the shelf and borrow it from another site and immediately apply it to your site. It will never be effective. You have got to personalize and individualize an emergency plan for your specific site. And your plan should include that information that is institutionally specific. So what are the floor plans for your actual site? How do you get out, depending on what's the evacuation route for people? What's the evacuation route for the collections if you're in an emergency situation? Again, where are your emergency resources? Who are your suppliers if you have to get stuff afterward? What are the roles and responsibilities? Who does what? Where's your call or contact list? Do you have that in your phone? Do you store a copy at home at all times? How many people have a copy of that? Who's included in it? Of course, you think about your primary staff, but what other people might you need to contact in the case of an emergency? Do you have your insurance broker's phone number off-site? Do you have the number of your preservation architect or your collections conservator or your peers at your neighboring institutions who might be able to lend a hand if you need to deal with an emergency situation? So think through comprehensively who should be on that call and contact list. What are those evacuation procedures? And are there any kind of checklists that you use? I talked about our kind of top 10 list for artifacts for evacuation. Are there other checklists that you have for your site that would be useful for staff or volunteers actually on the ground? So those are the kind of chunks, the sections of the plan that we would usually want to include. In addition to developing a plan and putting together that document, then there's a training component, of course, that our plan should have. So after the plan is developed and in place, then you have to share it with the folks who would be affected if there actually was an emergency. So this is going to be a bigger group than just your planning group that was sitting around the table hashing out all the details. This is going to be any staff member or volunteer person at the site who may have to respond in the case of an emergency. It's critical for them to know specifically, what am I responsible for? So when the fire alarm goes off, what do I do? What do you need me to be doing? And who's in charge? If I don't know, or who am I taking, a direction from in the case of an emergency? And what do I, and whatever my role is, what do I need to know? Is there information included in the manuals that train me? Is there some kind of an orientation program when I'm hired or recruited to volunteer in the museum? Do we have fire drills where we get to practice the procedure for evacuation? Do we have CPR or first aid training? Who gets that? How often? And then what's our kind of update and review process for all of those various pieces? I find that when your operations kind of grow, you wind up with all of these various policies and procedures, and you update one, and then maybe forget that there's a trickle down. So if we update our emergency plan, we then have to go back through our employee handbook, and we have to look at our volunteer training manual, because there are emergency procedure aspects in both of those that we might kind of forget about. So you have to look at all the updating and review process for your various policies and procedures. I include here, it's not very clear on the screen, I apologize, but I will put these documents online for you all also. Just a quick excerpt from our volunteer training manual. So we have a section that goes through some of the most common emergencies that they could deal with. This is a fire emergency section, and it just walks through very quickly. If you see fire or smell smoke, or if the fire alarm sounds, here's what you do. First, stay calm. Second, if it's not already ringing, pull the nearest fire alarm, and it gives the location of where those are in the museum. Third, page the staff. Fourth, evacuate them. Evacuate yourself and any visitors that you have, and count your visitors. It gives the location of where to meet and convene outside the site, and it tells folks to not release any visitors until they have checked in with the supervising staff, so that we can make sure we have a full count of anyone who was in the building at the time. So this is just one section, and there are other sections, of course, in our volunteer handbook for other kinds of emergencies. Lots and lots and lots of resources out there, which is great. Yesterday during the fundraising presentation, I passed around a resources handout. On one side were fundraising resources, on the other side were emergency plan resources. So all of these are also in that handout and will also be online. D-Plan is a wonderful online emergency plan kind of organizational tool. It is hosted by the Northeast Document Conservation Center, NEDCC, and NEDCC also has other resources and tools that are available. Heritage Preservation is a group that's specifically focused on collections preservation and historic structure preservation, and they have a lot of tools available, including a nice little salvage wheel. It's like an emergency planning tool that tells you kind of what to do in the case of an emergency for different types of collections and what kinds of resources and phone numbers are out there for you to use. The American Alliance of Museums, AAM, has a resource bank online. If you are a member, you can get access to all sorts of wonderful tools, as well as sample documents from other institutions, and you can target those sample documents to be similar to your institution. So they could be similar in terms of type of institution, like a historic site as opposed to an art museum. They could be similar in terms of budget size, staff size, so they can help give you templates that are most appropriate for your site. If you are not a member of AAM, Dumbarton House is, and as the national headquarters, we are happy to help get resources to you. So if there's ever anything that you would like access to that you don't have access to currently, just give us a call and we can get sample documents and resources to you from AAM or any of our other professional affiliates. Yes? The cost for AAM varies, and there's a sliding scale. They have 3 tiers of membership right now for institutions, and they have a different, different benefits available at each of the 3 tiers. And the 3rd tier, which is the most robust tier of membership options or resource options, is a sliding scale based on budget. And you can add on a component so that staff can access resources. And have full access individually as well as an institution.
If you were planning to pursue accreditation, did you join first?
question. There is an annual accreditation fee to be accredited, which I think is about $250. And that is separate and distinct from membership. And I will have to double check. I think that you need to be an institutional member to be accredited, but I'm not 100% sure of that, so I will double check that at the break and let you know. Certainly access to those resources that they have is a really helpful part of going through preparing for accreditation. So I think you would find it useful to become a member. Don't recreate the wheel when it comes to emergency planning. So use the resources that are available, but again, don't think that you can just take one of these sample documents off the shelf and approve it at your next board meeting for your site. You absolutely have got to go through the process of personalizing it and thinking through the logistics for your specific institution before it can be really appropriate for you. So again, I did mention that handout, the one handout yesterday that has emergency planning resources and websites, and we will post them and links to them also on the NSCDA website for you. And at your tables, another document that you have, it's pink on most tables, or at least the top copy is pink, is a handout that is a nice kind of summary. You can see there's tabs on the right-hand side, so this is meant to be kind of the first page in a binder with different sections. And this is a good starting point for collecting important contact information if in the event of an emergency. It is not meant to be a comprehensive emergency plan. It's a starting point for, again, collecting contact information. And the last page of it has information on emergency supplies that you might want to have available, an inventory, so to speak. Okay, so I would like you to leave here with something tangible. So think through for a minute and jot down some notes. When you get home from this meeting, who should be responsible for leading the emergency planning process at your site? If you don't already have an emergency plan, or if you aren't sure, or if you think you have one but it probably needs to be updated, who would lead that effort? Is that you? Is that someone else, the head of a different committee, or a staff member? So who would be responsible for leading that process? And who else besides that person needs to be part of the process? So who at your particular site should be at the table while you're working through this emergency planning process? And finally, what are your action items when you leave here? I think workshops like this are wonderfully helpful, but I find that if I don't write down actual action steps, kind of a little to-do list for when I get home, but when I get home, I'll be so bogged down with all the emails that have cropped up while I was here and dealing with the emergencies that are going on the site, that I don't always get to implement all the wonderful things that I learned about. So take 30 seconds now. I'm going to be quiet at the mic purposely, and I want you to write down 3, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 5, but tangible things that you want to do with this information that we just talked about when you get back to better prepare yourself and your museum property for an emergency. Something they're going to do with their site when they get back? Yes, Peggy?
I'm gonna find the plan that we have.
Great.
Figure out where it is.
That is a good first step. Find the existing plan. Where is it? And what does that thing say? Excellent. How many of us had that on our list? Great. Any other action steps you want to share? Great. Karen held up the tabs as the handout as a starting point. I think that's a great first step too, just collecting the contact information that you need. Okay.
It also reminded me that we have a museum in Philadelphia, a museum in Allegheny County, and we have a rental house next to our headquarters. So we really have 4 places we have to pay attention to, and
Right.
it hadn't dawned on me before.
Right. Absolutely. And each location is going to have an individualized plan. So you can take pieces probably and translate them across all of the properties, but there's going to have to be different evacuation routes and different specific sections related to the collections in each of those properties. So excellent points. Now, this was kind of nuts and bolts on what should go into your document, but what about financing emergencies? How do we pay for things and plan for financial emergencies? I am not going to talk about insurance because Catherine Kamek is going to be talking about insurance next, but insurance should be a part of your planning for emergencies. Having coverage, what coverage do you need and how much? Do I have a question back there? Yes, Hillary.
Thanks, Karen. I was wondering if in your emergency plan or in any you've read, if there's discussion about what a museum property does when it has a huge amount of property. If there's a template for your local forest.
Excellent.
Or the riverfront.
Right. Yes, I would say Dumbarton House's plan does not have a lot about a significant section about grounds because we have 1.2 acres. It's a nice piece of property, but we're not talking dozens or hundreds of acres of property. But there are absolutely a number of historic sites and institutions that have vast landscapes to deal with. So yes, I'm sure that there are examples out there, Hillary, that we could find that would be relevant for a site like Gunston Hall, for example. So absolutely, that is something that you really should think about when you do have vast property surrounding your building. It's not just about the building. Good. Okay, so think about insurance, and Catherine will tell us more about that in just a few minutes. Also think about a capital reserve fund or some kind of money in the bank for capital projects. I tend to think that routine, even major maintenance and capital repairs should not constitute an emergency. We all know through our own management of our homes that your systems need upkeep and routine maintenance, and so you have to plan for those. You know, your light bulbs are going to go out, you need to plan to replace them. Your roof is going to leak, you need to plan to keep that up. Your HVAC system, your heating and cooling system is going to need to be maintained, and it's not going to last forever. So what is the life expectancy of those big pieces of your system, of your site, and when are they going to need to be maintained, repaired, and replaced? How often? What kind of schedule does that put in place for you? So at the bottom of the slide here, I mentioned a preservation plan. Dumbarton House has a preservation plan that talks about cyclical maintenance, so some of that routine maintenance that goes on the property and who's responsible for it and how often it happens, as well as a capital repairs and replacement schedule. So when do we need to plan to replace the roof? How about the water heater? How about the HVAC system? Deferred maintenance, putting off maintenance this year will simply create a preservation emergency next year or at some future year. So you have to plan for the routine maintenance and the significant capital repairs and upgrades and replacement to keep a property running, or else you will create an emergency for yourself down the road. A capital reserve fund can be a savings account, so to speak, to help fund some of that capital repairs and replacement. And you see it typically at sites kind of as a stepping stone before having perhaps a fully funded endowment that supports all of your kind of routine maintenance. So if you don't have an endowment that's big enough to kick off income to support all of your maintenance at a site, a capital reserve fund might be a vehicle that could be useful for you in planning for financing these routine and major capital repairs and upgrades. I think you see this a lot of times for kind of homeowners associations or community associations. I know I live in a townhouse and we have a capital repairs budget, so every year kind of a part of our budget goes into the savings for the future repair of all of the brick walls around the property or the future repaving of all the parking lots. Even if it's not something that's going to be done next year, we're always socking away a little bit of money to put toward those projects down the line. You can save a percentage of your budget every year if you're able to, kind of put it in as a line item, or perhaps you fund depreciation. Some sites do that. So that, again, you're putting money away to deal with these issues so they don't become emergencies down the road. In terms of your kind of annual planning, you could also, probably should also budget for miscellaneous repairs. Of course, we all have projects that we know have to be accomplished, but there's always going to be something that comes up unexpectedly. And so rather than be surprised and shocked every time something comes up unexpectedly, you could prepare kind of a little slush amount or filler amount in your budget to prepare for those unexpected or unidentified items. This is unclear on the slide, but in front of you at your tables, what the white handout has just a one page from the Dumbarton House budget. It says Dumbarton House, NSDA Headquarters and Museum, FY14, budget revision details. It's lovely Excel lines. This is one page of a 9-page budget, but this includes our facilities and grounds section. And about 3/4 of the way down, I have in blue arrows pointing to an actual line item that we have for miscellaneous major repairs in the Dumbarton House budget. Dumbarton House has about $1 million budget. And you can see in that one line item for FY14, we've got about $21,000 in place for unidentified major repairs. If something pops up, this gives us the ability to address it without having to have a crisis in terms of financing. And if we don't have an emergency or an unexpected repair, we've always got a wish list of facilities projects that could be accomplished in any given year. So when it gets to be the 3rd or 4th quarter, we haven't had that emergency, it gives us the ability to perhaps address some of those lower priority facilities projects. We never know, as an example, we never know how much we're going to need to spend on shoveling and plowing because it depends on what happens with the weather that winter. But I certainly don't want to get caught short if we have a particularly snowy winter. So this gives us the ability to deal with that without having a crisis in January. And if we don't use that money for snow removal, we have it for other issues that might pop up. So that's one kind of technique in your budgeting that can help. Yes, Karen?
What is the program that you're using for your budget, or this?
Well, this is a lovely Excel document. Yeah, this is Excel, but it's the starting place I use is QuickBooks, which is our accounting software. So I'll take our QuickBooks budget from past years, I'll export that profit and loss statement, and then I'll kind of personalize it and add columns for budget planning. So it starts as QuickBooks, and this is an actual Excel document. I love Excel. I'm not an Excel genius. There's a ton that Excel does that I don't even know about. I'm just learning about pivot tables. Anyway, so if you want to nerd out with me on Excel, let me know, and I'm happy to talk to you more about it. Okay, so in addition to kind of planning in your annual budget for emergencies, you can also think about contingency budgeting, and this is looking at not so much, oh my gosh, if a facility's emergency strikes or a weather emergency strikes, but more of if a financial emergency strikes. What happens if our income doesn't meet our projections? So we do a budget every year, and our budget includes a list of what we plan to spend money on, all of our expenses. It also includes a list of where we think all of our income is coming from. Well, what happens if we get a quarter of the way through the year or halfway through the year and that income isn't coming in on target? How do we address that? A contingency budget allows you to avoid crisis decisions in that case. So what it means is that at the start of the year, you identify contingency plans for your budget. And you identify them before you're in the middle of the emergency or the crisis so that you can make the decisions thoughtfully and when you're not in the middle of them. And the goal is to identify cuts that will enable you to retain as much of your mission activity as possible. So you want to be able to, kind of trim the fat where possible, as opposed to having to make, a terrible cut in a mission-critical program. On the Dumbarton House side of things, for example, I would want to try always to retain our school programs for DC public school students. It's a critical piece of our education mission, and so if we had to make cuts, we try to identify places to make those cuts that are less mission critical. And so when you are developing a contingency budget, you have to identify three things. You have to identify what to cut. You have to identify what are the triggers. So what's going to tell us if we need to cut or when we need to cut, what triggers the cuts. And then how do you track that? How do you keep checking on whether you've hit a trigger or not? So I'm going to come back to the what do you cut and start with what are our triggers. And these can be different for your site, but you have to have some triggers. So at Dumbarton House, we have kind of a Plan A operating procedure. We have contributions and earned income, and those are coming in as expected. They're on target with budget. Therefore, we need to make no change with our budget, and so we're going to save no money. We're going to operate with our budget that we approved at the start of our fiscal year. Things are chugging along great. We then come up with two contingencies, a Plan B and a Plan C. Plan B is, okay, what happens if contributions and earned income drop 10% below budgeted level for this fiscal year? So my first trigger is our contributions and earned income are 10% off. They're 10% under what we had projected them to be. If that's the case, I need to save about $48,000 in this particular fiscal year example. And so I need to cut 5.3% of our budget. That's how our kind of numbers work out. The Dumbarton House budget, we have income coming from the NSCDA, and that's a fairly stable income piece. It's coming from investment and from NSCDA transfer. So typically the NSCDA is not going to cut our budget mid-year on their piece of the income. Contributions and earned income are the second and third piece of the Dumbarton House income puzzle. And those pieces are variable. They're going to go up or down depending on how successful we're doing in contributions and earned revenue that particular year. So that's what we use as our trigger. If those contributions and earned income drop 10% below budget, we've got to cut $48,000 off of our expenses. Plan C is if our contributions and earned income drop 20% below budget, in which case we've got to cut $97,000 off our budget. If you hit an emergency and you're not planned for it, even in $1 million budget, ladies, $48,000 in cuts is going to be pretty hard to make a snap decision on in the middle of the year when you have a crisis. Certainly $97,000 worth of cuts is going to be tough for us to come up with. And so a contingency budget helps me and helps our board and our executive committee think through these cuts early in the year when we're not in the middle of an emergency, so it's not emotional and it's not a crisis decision. Our triggers, those are our triggers. How do we track that income so that we know if we're on target? I use Excel again here. So you have this on the back of that handout that's at your table. It's probably clearer to see. And my staff, Bridget and Scott, this probably looks familiar to them because I do pull this out at meetings. So at the end of each month during the year, I track our income. I am looking for a couple things. So you can see up at the top I've got the NSCDA chunk, the transfer piece. Then I've got all of our various contribution sections. And then I've got all of our earned revenue categories. That comes in as kind of our total income down at the bottom. And my triggers, again, at Dumbarton House, our triggers are based on our contributions plus our earned income. So my bottom line in this spreadsheet is our contributions plus our earned income. What is that running at that particular snapshot, that particular month? In the top left, you can see this is our numbers as of April 30th of 2013. So at the end of April, this is the snapshot that I took to see how we were doing. And I compare this year, which was the FY13 column, to 2 previous years. That's just for my kind of management. I want to see how we're doing compared to last year or the year before. But those aren't my triggers for our contingency plan. That's not how I know if I'm going to make cuts, because it doesn't matter how I'm doing compared to last year. What matters from a contingency budget perspective is how I'm doing compared to what our budget was, what our plan was for this year. So I've got my budget in the column over here, the budget column. And then my final column all the way on the right is the percent of the budget. Now on April 30th, we are 2/3 of the way through our fiscal year at Dumbarton House. That means my target at the end of April is 66.66666%. Okay, I want to be about 67% of the way through the year. I want ideally to have collected at least 66% of my income to know I'm on target for the year. And remember, ladies, my triggers were contributions and earned falling 10% below or falling 20% below. So my goal is 66%. I see here my contributions are running at 76%. My earned revenue is running at 75%. So down here, my very bottom line, right-hand column, contributions and earned income are running at 75%. This is a good number. This means we are over our projected income for that point in the fiscal year. I have not hit a trigger. If that bottom right number was 57%, I'd have to move into Plan B on my budget. Because if that hit 57%, my contributions and earned income would be 10% below my target, and we'd have to start instituting some cuts. If, God forbid, it was 47%, we'd have to move to the Plan C because we'd then be tracking 20% below budget. And realistically, I'm not going to hit 20% below budget in a random month if I haven't tracked 10% below budget probably the month or two prior. It would be very unusual for us to be that far off budget kind of overnight. Operationally, I usually don't start tracking this until we're about 3 months into the fiscal year because our first couple months, cash doesn't always come in exactly the same amount on every month basis, so I'll let us go a couple of months. When we certainly get halfway through the fiscal year, it's important to know if we're running on budget or not. And if we need to make cuts, the farther you get into the fiscal year, the harder it is to cut expenses because you've already spent half your money for the year. So where are you going to come up with those cuts that you need to make? Does the tracking make sense? You could simplify this. You do not need to have multiple years of data on here. You don't need to have all of your line items. I, again, just do that from my own perspective so I can see where specific drops or increases are. You could just do the bottom piece, the contributions and earned and the total, to figure out if you need to make cuts or not. So it can absolutely be simplified. And then the piece that you also need, of course, is, okay, what are those cuts if we hit those trigger points? So here's an example of us for a Plan B. Plan B, if our earned income and contribution drop 10%, we need to cut $48,000 in expenses. And so at the beginning of the year, we look at our budget and we say, how are we going to come up with $48,000 in cuts the least painfully without impacting our mission? And so in this particular year, this was, I think, FY10, we identified, well, we could push the boiler room leak repair back. That's a $20,000 line item. That would save us $20,000. We have a system in place where we can manage the leak for this year if we have to. So if we have to cut, we can push that off to next year. We could postpone some of these curatorial projects, conservation, consultation, archival supplies at about $12,000. We could scale back our facilities project manager contract and do more of that management in-house. We could scale back potentially some of our accounting contract. We could cut some hours off of our housekeeping. We could cut some printing projects. We could cut 10% of our advertising budget, and that would be how we came up with $48,000 in cuts. Your cuts are going to be, of course, different for your site, but just to give you an example. The Plan B is a lot harder. At Dumbarton House, we cannot come up with $10,000 in cuts without impacting staff salaries. My staff know this. That would be very bad if we had to cut back that dramatically, not just for staff, but overall. It would mean significant cuts in other areas also. From a management perspective, something that I always present to our executive committee is that if we get to that point and we have to make staffing cuts, I always propose my cuts first. If I'm going to be proposing staff cuts for salaries, as executive director, I would want my salary reduced first before we have to touch the rest of the staff salaries. If we have to touch everybody's salaries, so be it. I'm certainly going to be one of the everybody that's going cut. And it's important, again, to remember that you have to be tracking this on a monthly basis, because if you get halfway through the year, we've already been paying salaries for half the year. You know, it's harder to make cuts the farther into the year you go. It's harder to save money. Okay, so those are examples of contingency budgeting. We started our contingency budget process at Dunbar and House back in 2008 or 2009, right when the recession hit and some of our income projections were coming in below target. And I have found it to be immensely helpful from a management perspective in preparing, even though we haven't had to make cuts except for, I think, that first year, the worst year of the recession. So it's been very helpful, and luckily we haven't had to scale back and cut back the budget mid-year. So what do you want to do when you get home to prepare for financing emergencies? Again, take a second, jot down some thoughts from what we just talked about in terms of insurance, capital reserve, budgeting for miscellaneous repairs, contingency budgeting. What do you want to take home with you as an action step? I want you to write down your homework, Jane, first. So jot down your homework. And would anyone like to share what they're going to do when they get home? Or do you have any questions for me? We have a couple minutes before we turn over. Yes, Eva.
I said that I was going to, we have a reserve policy, and I think that I have stepped down as finance chairman, and we have a new one, and I'm sort of laying back so she can take possession of the job. But I think we ought to review our reserve plan. We do have a reserve plan, but it should probably be reviewed to see if it's up to date. It was done, like 2003, 2004. And we also have a situation where our dues, we send out the dues notices in February. So the first, and our fiscal year begins in June. So those first months have low income, except for we do start the annual giving in September, so that picks it up some. But when the auditor comes in and does it, she has a reserve. I mean, she reserves a certain amount of the dues collected from the year before to carry over into that period. And we're not really showing that in the budget, and we probably should, because the budget is always in deficit till you get to February.
And that is absolutely a cash flow issue that many sites face, where the bulk of the income comes in at one time, or certainly it is highly unusual that your income is going to come in evenly every 12 months. Every month is going to come in about the same. That is highly unusual. And so that's absolutely a cash flow issue that you need to plan for. And there are different methods for dealing with it, but you don't want to wind up short right before and not be able to pay bills before your dues come in February. And then you're going to be flush with cash in February when all the dues roll in. So that's absolutely a cash flow issue that you should plan for and need to plan for. Yes?
I wondered, one, can you be cloned? I mean, you are so wonderful. And if you cannot be cloned, what is the best way to find quality people to run these museums with your background who really, really know what they're doing? Because through this whole workshop, I have just thought, oh gosh, we're not doing that, and we have a director. So where do we find people like you who really know what
they're doing? There are wonderful professionals out there. I think working for the field, I am happy to share resources for recruitment in terms of graduate schools or places to post job opportunities. Happy to take a look at job descriptions or duties. I think the executive director position, if you have an executive director position, I think it's a challenging position no matter what organization you work for. I love my job. I love my job. I have a fabulous staff team working at Dumbarton House on behalf of all of you in the National Society, and I have a wonderfully supportive board. And even in that wonderful situation, it is a tough position because you are not one of your staff, and you are not one of your board, and you have to work in between these two. So anyone in an executive director position has challenges. I think it sometimes takes a special personality and skill set to work well with the National Society. I think there are some. I think there are some unique challenges. That said, there are challenges in every governance situation. So we're not totally unique. We share challenges with other types of organizations.
We recently done a search.
Yes. And we've had so Wilton has recently done a search. Gunston Hall has recently done a search. We are searching right now for a full-time development and marketing coordinator. So we certainly have sites that are have recently pursued or are actively pursuing staff and can help with that.
We had an outside advisor who was sent to us by Charlie,
Mm-hmm.
and she was very resourceful because we did a development director as well as an executive director.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in the posting we found that was best. We started out with using just the VA, the Virginia Association of Museums, but you really need to go to the AAM. It gives you a broader field.
And both are excellent resources, and absolutely AAM has a national reach in terms of job postings. And is
we got came from Wisconsin,
Mhm.
so I mean, it's
right. And the Gunston director came from the Midwest, so we, in our field, we definitely do travel. I do think on the board side of things, it's from a staff perspective, it is really important that you all think through very critically and specifically what you want out of the position. What is the staff person responsible for? What role are you all as board members playing? Is it a governing board, or are you all involved in the day-to-day operations? Because that's a different type of position for a staff person. Is it truly an executive director that you want, or do you really want an administrator? Are you really just looking for a society secretary? Don't call it an executive director if you really just need somebody answering the phone and scheduling your meetings, because you're not going to get the right person and they're not going to be happy. So it's, I think, imperative that you think really critically about what you're trying to accomplish and how who's responsible for what. And I think my time is up. So, ladies, thank you. And